We'll move on to Meredith Giuliani is going to tell us, educate us hopefully on what exactly the definition of globalization is, and how they're constructing a global curriculum.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity to present today this work on behalf of my co-authors from the University of Toronto and Maastricht University. For those of you who may not be familiar with the concept, globalization is an openness to trade, ideas, investment, people, and culture, and its influence on an international scale. And it's facilitated by transportation and communication technologies. And things in the medical field that are linked to globalization are the rise of non-communicable diseases, the emergence of new communicable diseases. So prior I had spoken about Zika, but I think now we would all speak about COVID, obesity rates, and the use of tobacco. And while non-communicable diseases are rising, cancer is one of those non-communicable diseases. And what we're seeing is a growing health human resource crisis in cancer care. And one of the things that's driving that is there's just really a lack of enough providers to provide the amount of cancer care that's needed. And one of the mechanisms that are being discussed and implemented to mitigate that health human resource crisis is increasing training programs and the sharing of curricula with a global focus. So there are many potential unintended effects of engaging in this form of global standardization, and one of them is the concept of neocolonialism, so perpetuating the Western medical priorities through curricula. And so to your question about glocalization is relevant to this discourse because it refers in medical education to developing the skills and knowledges that address both universal priorities and particular priorities to a local space. And what is greatly lacking in the global-local debate in medical education is evidence, either positive or negative, of the impact of global curricula on clinical care, the health system, and trainees' knowledge and skills. And we've seen in the Lancet Commission, and I've put a nice quote there from Julio Frank and his co-authors, about the historical legacies of curricula and how they can be tied to old traditions, and they may not represent what is needed for patients in the healthcare system. So what is a global curricula? There is no one definition in the literature, but for our work, this is the definition that we've used, and we've conceptualized it as a text which uses a common vocabulary and shared philosophy, and looking at something that's applicable across nations. And we heard an example of what would be considered a global curriculum earlier in Yannick's presentation about the Estro core curriculum. And so what are some of the motivations? So when you look into the literature about motivations for creating these type of shared curricula, they talk about things like harmonizing training standards, improving the quality of training, and promoting the mobility of physicians. And I won't get into the complexities associated with some of those motivations, but I think the thing to focus on is this concept of standardization. And we think of standards often as a positive thing, and that they're politically neutral, but in fact they're not. If you look more deeply at the process of standardization and how standards come about, they can be rooted in political history, and there can be power dynamics that are very relevant to this. So the aim of our project was to understand how global curricula are conceptualized and implemented, and how that relates to local contexts of power and culture. And so we did this through semi-structured interviews. We created an interview guide, and through snowball sampling recruited 14 international participants, and we were purposeful about our sampling to ensure that we had diverse participants from around the world with diverse perspectives. The interviews were audio taped and transcribed verbatim, and we used an anti-colonial framework to facilitate our analysis. And we used an abductive approach to the coding of these data. And abductive approach basically means that you use a combination of your theoretically derived codes, and also you can capture emerging codes. So you sort of move back and forth between the data, which is what we did as an investigative group. And we recruited 14 participants. They were from Europe, Africa, Asia, Latin America, North America, and Oceania. And they were a mix of medical and radiation oncology professionals. And they articulated 5 key challenges with global curricula. And throughout the theme that emerged from all of these challenges is that you could leverage the concept of diversity to mitigate some of these challenges. So the first thing that people talked about were ambiguous or conflicting perspectives on what you were trying to do with these curricula. And what was really needed was spending more time to build consensus about purpose prior to engaging in the work. The next was an insufficient representation of diverse perspectives. And this is a complicated topic. We heard in Yannick's presentation about how many countries, for example, are present in the definition of Europe, but is simply being present in the room as the representative from a particular country, is that sufficient to address diversity? Or is it actually more complicated in the way in which the creation of the curriculum is sort of conceptualized and facilitated by the moderators? The next is a rigid conceptualization of the competency requirements. So what is considered needed for independent practice in one country may not be what is considered needed for independent practice in another country. And who is right? That's a very complicated concept. The fourth challenge was the mismatch between curricular requirements and local context. And a very tangible example of that is the length of training that someone would be considered to be the minimum length of training for a radiation oncologist. So many of us are familiar with 5-year training programs. Many documents talk about that. But that is very much not the case in many countries in the world. And it's actually seen as an advocacy mechanism of these curricula for people to advocate for more resources to lengthen their training where they perceive that to be necessary, because there's often tensions between being protected to train and the need to provide service to patients. And if we think back to that initial slide where there are large health human resource gaps, there's often a lot of political pressure and other things in that space. And then finally is the influence of power relationship and decision makers and how hierarchies, which are often linked to historical legacies, will influence what is reflected in the final product of these curricula. And so that needs to be mitigated. And so why does any of that matter? We took the lens of global curricula, but I think anyone here who's ever participated in a curriculum development project can probably identify with some of those political pieces that go into it. How much time is spent on breast cancer versus brain tumors versus head and neck. At the medical school level, it relates to how much time is given to oncology versus other specialties. But what we found was unique was that importance of that advocacy role that these type of curricula have in terms of advocating for educational resources in diverse contexts, and then the need to leverage diversity, and that's really a really practical takeaway from this, and that it's not just about who is invited to participate, it's about how their participation is facilitated and how the diverse perspectives are sort of realized in the final product. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.